Earlier this week, we released our brand new SAPPHIRE Nitro Plus, Pulse and Pure versions of the AMD Radeon 7900 GRE. Since the 7900 GRE has technically been around for a little while at this point, there's already a bunch of content online testing many of the usual suspects. And for that reason, I'm only going to be focusing on games that have released very recently. All the footage that you're going to see today has been captured at a 4K resolution, and the recording was handled by AMD Relive. All the performance overlays are provided by Rivertune Statistics server, and so, yeah, let's get right to it. Once I got the Nitro Plus version of the 7900 GRE installed, the first game that I jumped into was Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. Granted, this game tends to put a lot more pressure on the CPU than it does the GPU, but still, there's something about seeing hundreds of enemies swarming towards the player with those particle effects popping off all over the place and damage numbers flooding the screen that just twists that dopamine release valve that's buried deep in my brain. Visually, I think the game looks quite nice. Sure, it's not exactly a next generation graphical showcase, but it does manage to present a really pleasant level of image quality, and despite the chaos, it remains smooth at all times, and it's safe to say that our Nitro Plus RX 7900 GRE barely broke a sweat. Which, unsurprisingly, was pretty much what I experienced when I finally jumped into Lethal Company. Personally, I've not really played all that much Lethal Company at all, though I've most certainly enjoyed watching many others do so. In fact, I only installed the game in order to capture this footage because whilst the game is certainly, well, let's be honest, ugly to its core, over the years I've become somewhat accustomed to many multiplayer indie games struggling when it comes to optimization. Thankfully, I've not found that to be the case here, and so I swiftly moved on to The Expanse. Now, this was a game that caught me a little off guard because whilst in many ways the game is somewhat visually understated, the lighting, shadows and image quality are all surprisingly decent. It caught me off guard because I don't think that I've actually spent much time with any Telltale game since The Wolf Among Us, and that was over a decade ago at this point. The Expanse, in my honest opinion, finds itself in a rather awkward spot when it comes to that balance between presentation and performance. Like I just mentioned, the game looks decent, but at the same time that makes the game rather heavy. Don't get me wrong, I think the performance is justified on a technical perspective. I'm just not sure that most gamers are going to be able to fully appreciate where some of that performance has been spent. With that said, I never got time to check out the lower presets, so maybe this game does in fact offer a great balance between presentation and performance when configured to more optimal settings. When I moved over to Palworld, I was once again reminded at just how time consuming a lot of these modern games are starting to become. I played this game at 4K high settings with textures set to Epic and anti-aliasing set to TSR, which I'm assuming adds some upscaling by default since it does seem to perform a fair bit better than the game's standard TAA. Image quality wise the game is fine, but I'm probably not the best person to talk about the visuals because they're simply not in a style that I'm into. This session lasted a good couple of hours, but I'm still not all that sure that I made that much progress. The game just feels so incredibly slow, and whilst I do consider myself a fan of these kinds of open world survival games, I just don't have as much free time as I'd like in order to really commit to a game quite as slow as Palworld. That said, I do hope that the gameplay that I did manage to capture is at least somewhat a reliable glimpse of the performance offered by the 7900 GRE. Another game that kind of feels just as, if not even slower than Palworld, is the world's first quadruple A game, Skull and Bones. For this game, I stuck with the very high preset, again at 4K but with TAA set to quality. Normally I would have gone with FSR, but unfortunately that does result in some rather gnarly ghosting, so TAA it is. Performance wise, we're sticking above 60 FPS the vast majority of the time, but I'd be lying if I was to say that I wasn't expecting a little more, especially when you take into consideration the performance offered by the recent Assassin's Creed games. Visually, I'm not even sure that Skull and Bones looks much, if any, better than the recent Assassin's Creed games either. And whilst the water itself is somewhat impressive, I think that we've been spoiled by the water quality of Sea of Thieves, meaning that I find it a little bit harder to appreciate than what I probably should. Helldivers 2 on the other hand is a game that I was able to appreciate almost instantly. This game runs on the Autodesk Stingray engine, and whilst I don't actually know too much about Stingray, what I do know is that I like the look of almost every single game running on it, so it's a shame that the engine was discontinued back in 2018. The game manages to pull off a really thick atmosphere, and whilst being somewhat CPU heavy, it runs extremely smoothly. Something that I really like about Helldivers 2 is just how different it manages to feel in a sea of games that for the most part tend to feel pretty samey. Here I'm running the game's high graphical preset with resolution scaling set to its quality mode. This is one of those games that if you're able to reach a set level of performance, you really don't need to worry about anything else because the game just feels so incredibly consistent in terms of its visual and frame time delivery. Having played the game for myself, I'm not at all surprised that it's done as well as it has in terms of its player numbers and overall success. Okay, so onto the part of the video that I was dreading the most, Suicide Squad. This is a game that really hasn't been a massive success, but hear me out, I kinda wish that it did a lot better than what it seems to be doing. I'm not going to get involved in the whole live service discussion or whether or not the game is woke or even if they've butchered the source material because quite frankly, I really couldn't care less. I'm not really all that in the loop when it comes to superhero / comic book media at the best of times. But what I can tell you is that after the countless hours that I spend playing all sorts of different games, I kinda found Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League as a kind of palate cleanser, mainly due to finding a fair amount of enjoyment in the story and characters. Don't get me wrong, this game is unlikely to be remembered as anything particularly special, but that's not to say that it's anywhere near as bad as much of the gamersphere would have you believe. Rocksteady's cinematography is on point, the performance capture is mostly excellent, and when it comes to the overall presentation, I think the game looks more than just good. There are a few technical issues that do somewhat dampen the experience, such as some heavy CPU limitations at times, and more generalised frame pacing issues with the odd stutter, but overall, I found the game to be mostly okay. Obviously, the reason why I've been dreading this section of the video is because I am well aware that public opinion is pretty much in opposition to my own impressions, but all I can be is honest, and I can honestly say that I found the game to be a lot more enjoyable than most reviews would have had me believe. Now, before we move on, please forgive me if I am about to butcher some probably already out-of-date lingo, but Pacific Drive is kind of a vibe. I really don't know what more to say, there's just something about driving around whilst looking for worthwhile loot in a beautiful, yet hostile environment that I find super immersive. I think the last game to give me the same kind of vibe was actually Metro Exodus, so yeah, it's been a while. I had the game set to its high preset, again at a 4K resolution with TXAA anti-aliasing, but I also had the resolution slider set to 67%, which would be the equivalent of quality level upscaling. The game is surprisingly heavy performance wise, which I kind of think is like the Expanse in terms of the simple art style somewhat masking expectations. One area of the visual presentation that I did really notice, however, was just how decently the game managed to handle level of detail. There was very little pop-in, and that led to the game having a fairly consistent level of presentation at all times. Unfortunately, there was a small amount of stutter at times, and that did manage to break my immersion. It was by no means as bad as what we've seen in the past from many games, but it was noticeable. I'm guessing that these are mainly due to caching, as they did become less frequent the more that I played. But anyway, that is all the game that I've managed to pump some time into since getting my hands on the SAPPHIRE Nitro RX 7900 GRE. Right now, I'm currently sitting on a cardboard box in my living room editing this video since I'm currently in the process of moving, hence why this video is a few days later than I would have hoped. Fingers crossed everything goes smoothly, and then I'm hoping to start work on a video showcasing the graphical evolution of the Call of Duty franchise, so please be sure to hit that subscribe button if that's something you're interested in seeing. Also, be sure to check out the Pulse, Pure and Nitro Plus versions of the RX 7900 GRE. For now though, from myself and everybody here at the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel, thank you so much for stopping by, and until next time, we'll catch you later. Bye bye.